Good morning. My name is Catherine Wolfram. I'm a professor of energy economics at MIT Sloan School of Management, and happy to be joined by my co-panelists, who I will introduce in a second. We're going to talk about the future of climate change policy, specifically for a conference of economists focusing in on carbon pricing and some recent developments there. And I know it's a fractured time. There are a lot of competing interests that governments are facing, a lot of pushback against climate policy, especially with rising energy costs associated with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But we have a great panel here, and I think there is actually room for optimism, and hopefully we'll get to some of those discussions. So to my right, I have, or I guess my left, your right, is Frank Ghiozzo, who's a professor at Australia National University, where he directs the Center for Climate and Energy Policy. Frank has also been a senior author on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC reports. So those are the UN-led big reports that come out periodically. Frank has been actively involved on that. He also led the Australian review of the Australian leakage review about the carbon border adjustment mechanism policy, potentially Australia adopting something that the EU has embraced, and hopefully we'll get to talk about that. CBAM, I think CBAM is the most important climate policy development that we've seen. Okay, and then to Frank's left is Vaibhav Chaturvedi. Vaibhav is a senior fellow at the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water in Delhi. CEW is a very trusted advisor to the Indian government. Vaibhav has also been involved with the IPCC. He co-edited a report, or a chapter of one of the recent reports, and he's been involved with other UNFCCC, which is another UN climate group. He's been involved with other UNFCCC initiatives. He's also an adjunct professor at the oldest business school in India, XLRI. And then last but not least is Atifat Multitacharan, did I get that right? Yes, Multitacharan. He's a professor of economics at Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. He's advised the Thai government and the Asian Development Bank on tax and climate policy, and he serves as an advisor to Thailand's Minister of Finance. So thanks so much to all of you for joining. We're going to start by I've asked each of the speakers to make some brief remarks, just outlining the state of climate policy in their country, in their region, and then we'll get to a more fulsome discussion about climate policy. And I also just want to tease that the four of us have been involved with about 15 other colleagues in a working group on climate coalitions. So this is something that we're going to talk about and hopefully get you excited about the future of climate policy and carbon pricing with kind of these mini-lateral coalitions. So let me start first with Frank. Thanks.
Let me use the lectern if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, look, industrial decarbonization is what we want to talk about. And it's something that enables a restructuring of global supply chains for heavy industry in particular. So when you think about the locations where heavy industry, steel, chemicals, other metal manufacturing, so forth, currently is, you've got it near the major population centers, near the major places where these products are consumed, for example, in car factories, and you have them usually on waterways that allows the transportation of raw materials, including fossil fuels, traditionally coal, but also gas and oil. And so in a low-carbon economy, a net zero emissions world economy, we should see a restructuring and a change in the global geography of heavy industry because we will be using renewable electricity for much of the energy input. That's very difficult to transport and will be very cheap to use in the places where strong renewable energy potential. Places like the west coast of America, especially South America, west coast of Africa, and Australia, of course, where I live and work. And that's where you want to see processing, for example, of iron ore into iron, of ammonia, all based on renewable electricity as the energy input. That's very much an Australian perspective on the issue. We have tremendous renewable energy potential in that continent. We're also a very large fossil fuel exporter. And there's a question there of economic transition and transformation, and of course the opportunity to kind of backfill for the export revenue that will inevitably fall, the coal and gas export revenue in our country's case, with export revenue from the processing of natural resources such as iron ore, but also production of synthetic carbon-free shipping fuels, for example, aviation fuel, green ammonia, fertilizer, and very importantly, green iron. Now, cost competitiveness, none of this can compete on cost grounds at this point in time. We can be confident that technology costs as well as cost of capital for these new types of installations will come down over time. We're moderately confident that willingness to pay for green products like green steel will emerge over time, probably first in niche markets like emblematic consumer products. You know, your next EV that you buy might be made from green steel as well, and you might pay a few $100s for a little badge on the back of it. And possibly also from government procurement, for example, in infrastructure projects. But, you know, for the large-scale adoption, we need policy instruments, obviously, to make that happen. Now, global green industry policy, by and large, is supply side, right? So making production cheaper, offsetting or defraying the cost of investment, and in some cases defraying the ongoing cost of operation of these clean, low-carbon industrial facilities. Also, we might observe that most of these policy instruments are nationally based or even nationalistic in outlook, right? So the goal certainly is to foster the emergence of these new green industries within each country, right, for the purpose of maintaining industrial identity or for the purpose of supply chain security, preserving jobs in industrial heartlands and that kind of thing. And of course, right, when the overall underpinnings of the new low emissions industrial economy suggests that this should be located in the places where clean energy is cheapest, this will lead to an overall inefficient outcome. And my biggest worry about green industry policy at this point in time is that if this continues for a long time in terms of the nationalistic outlook on policy support mechanisms, we could end up with a situation where we lock in production structures in places where they cannot be efficient. So, two examples, German government has been subsidizing the conversion of 2 steel plants to lower carbon settings, which means using gas and hydrogen in the middle of Europe. You've got to, import the gas, LNG conversion on the way, make green hydrogen in a place where renewable energy is scarce and very high cost. And that will, of course, lead to a high-cost solution where, maybe up to half is covered by government subsidies. Much better carbon pricing with border carbon adjustment that leads to a level playing field for all industrial installations, no matter where they are in the world, okay? And so, from the point of view of a country like Australia, or in fact many developing countries as well, this is a desirable outcome in the long term, right? Because carbon pricing at a reasonable level with border carbon adjustment will provide some underpinning for the emergence of these low emissions industries and resource processing industries on the basis of renewable energy in the places where it should be located because it's lowest cost. In Australia, we have a carbon price in the industrial sector. The government doesn't call it a carbon price. It's a baseline and credit scheme with credit trading. The reason it's not called a carbon price is simply politics. It's highly contentious, and the word carbon price carries very heavy negative political connotations. Catherine, you mentioned the Australian carbon leakage review that I led for government. It looked into the feasibility and desirability of a border carbon adjustment, like the CBAM, but perhaps with different implementation provisions for Australia, recommended consideration and adoption for some limited set of commodities to avoid, the undercutting of domestic industry's traditional carbon leakage argument. But importantly also, in order to create the preconditions for the emergence of green industries like green ammonia, and of course, from the point of view of a country that sees a green commodity future, and that sees carbon pricing and border carbon adjustments in other countries as an enabling factor for that, we wouldn't want to hang back and not introduce a CBAM-like element in the policy scheme. So much to get us started for my part of the world, Australia. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Frank. Let's next move to Vaibhav.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Very good morning to all colleagues here. Very excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation to the IEA. So I'll talk about developing countries' perspective on climate policy and carbon markets. And why I want to talk about from a developing country perspective, because in the climate policy debate, there you could say these two big camps, one is the developed world and there is the developing world, and there are big differences of opinion on many issues in the climate policy debate. So I want to focus on the developing country context in my opening remarks. So in the developing world, the climate policy is situated within the larger context of the developmental policy. Right? So it is sort of it's considered secondary to the development policy. And when I say that, it means that things like education, health, poverty, those are a lot more pressing concerns and bigger concerns than the issues related to climate policy per se. And that is how it is kind of framed. And if I just ask you, of course, you are a group of senior economists, so you would already know it. Let's say I come from India. What is India's per capita income? Let's say even in market exchange rate terms. How does it compare to, let's say, some countries in the developed world? Of course, you would know. So the answer is India's per capita income is around $3,000 per capita. Right? That's what it is. And the median number for Europe would be anything between 40 to 50,000. For US, it is 80,000 plus. So that's a crude indicator, but that is what we're talking about. For China, it is almost around 15,000 now. So that is the difference we are talking about. That is a crude indicator, but it gives you a context of what does it mean for a developing country? Because in a $3,000 per capita income, you have to really address issues which are developmental issues, and then comes the issue of climate policy. And why this context is important? Because climate policy, the mitigation policy is costly. If it was cheap, if it was easier to mitigate, then everybody would have done it. It is not the case. And what is being increasingly realized that even in the developed world, I think many of you would have heard about the Yellow Vest protests that happened in France. And this was because a country that has got high income tried to implement a climate policy through carbon prices, which increased the prices for energy, and it led to a big protest in the country, and they had to roll it back. So even for a developed world, it is kind of a challenging thing to do because mitigation is costly. In fact, for mitigation, there were two narratives. One narrative is that it is kind of costly, that I believe in. The other alternative narrative is that, well, it could lead to a lot of growth, could deliver on a lot of growth. So it is a source of growth. I think both are true. Well, it depends on where you stand, what are your starting point, what resources you have, what is the fiscal space you have. For example, for China has done amazing in terms of capturing the value in this new alternative order. Many countries in the developing world are not at that starting point, and they're not managed to do it. So for them, climate policy is mainly a source of cost and a challenge, rather than, even though it is an opportunity theoretically. So that is where you could say, the big developmental context behind the climate policy. That's why for India, the issues which are called equity issues in the climate policy debate, India is extremely vocal about equity issues. It's also extremely vocal about something called CBDR, which is a very commonly used term in the climate world. It means common but differentiated responsibility. It simply means that, well, all of us are in together. It is because it's a global problem. Still, there has to be a differentiation of responsibilities based on your respective capabilities. So if income is a crude indicator of respective capabilities, then, well, if a $3,000 economy should do something, but maybe the effort done by a $50,000 or $80,000 economy should be a lot more than something which is done by lower. So this notion of CBDR is also embedded, and that's what India keeps on talking a lot about. So that's the larger context within which India's policy operates. The question for us is, in terms of the carbon pricing debate, what does it mean for the carbon pricing debate also? So in India, the framing of the carbon market debate, the first thing, if you ask any Indian that, what do you think about carbon markets? So the first thing that comes to their mind is, well, we'll get a lot of money. Because that's what happened in India. Through one of the United Nations carbon market called the Clean Development Mechanism, India got a significant amount of money. So the estimates are somewhere around $500 million to $1.5 billion across 10 years flew to India through the sales of carbon credits. So, and it in fact motivated investments around $70 billion in this 10-year period. So it is a significant amount of money, and that's what many Indians think about. So that was the first framing, that it is a source of international climate finance. So that is the first framing. So the carbon market is an instrument for international climate finance. Now, when CBAM happened, it kind of changed. Well, then we realized that, well, something has to happen in terms of response to the CBAM. And that's where the government of India started thinking about its own carbon market, right? But then quickly that realization happened that the prices of carbon in EU are around like 90 euros and 100 euros because the mitigation policy is a lot more stringent there. In India, it's a lot more relaxed. So the carbon prices that India's market would deliver will probably in the near term maybe $10, $15, $20 at max. The differential is still huge. So even if we have our own carbon markets, it will not be a response to CBAM. And something else needs to be done. So now after this realization, you could say the final framing, or what everybody is now kind of adopting, is that carbon market is not really a source of international climate finance. It is a source of domestic decarbonization. It's an instrument for domestic decarbonization. So very different framing, and that's what Indians are kind of more and more getting around that framing, that it is going to be used as a domestic instrument for domestic mitigation. The third, what does it mean for the operationalization of carbon markets? Because it's a fast-growing economy. That's why if you look at Europe and many other countries, the emission trading markets are based on absolute permits or absolute carbon emissions. In developing countries which are fast-growing, and this is true for many, not just India, the targets that we are dealing with, even in terms of national climate policy, are what we call emission intensity of GDP targets, which means your GDP keeps on increasing, but the emissions per unit of GDP continue to decline. So it's not an absolute emissions cap, because the economy is kind of growing at 7, 6, 7, 8%, compared to economies that are growing at 2%, where you could do an absolute cap. Here it's extremely difficult to do an absolute cap, at least for the next 15, 20 years. That's why a lot of policy focuses on this one variable, which is the emission intensity, and that is what the carbon market also responds to. So that is what, how it is kind of framed. And my final point is about India's position on CBAM. And the interesting position it's not India's position, it's the developing world position. So the term that we are using, it's called unilateral trade measures. So UTM, that's what at the COP level, that's what India uses always, because India, if you broadly, let's say, divide the world into developed and developing world, and if you think where are the exports flowing, so apart from the very high value exports that the developed world does, large bunch of export comes from the developing to the developed world, and that is going to be probably taxed because of carbon, and many countries are thinking about doing it. So it's not just the EU that has started. It's the big fear is that many countries will start doing it. Right? So that's why the developing world, all the groupings at the COP platform, UNFCCC platform, they have started talking about or using this word, that framing it as a trade measure. That it is not, and versus the EU calls it a climate measure. So the framings are very different. Whatever is adopted in the text in the UN text, decision text, right now is not UTM. It is still called a climate measure, because that's how EU frames it. But the developing world completely focuses and calls it a unilateral trade measure. So that is a big difference on how we are perceiving CBAM, trade measure versus a climate measure. So with this, I will end, and happy to be discussing with all of you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Vaibhav. And last, Atifat.
Thank you for having me in this panel and for inviting me, Catherine. Let me begin by putting ASEAN in energy perspective. Southeast Asia is responsible for 4% of global GDP now, but according to the International Energy Agency, it will account for about 20% of global energy demand growth to 2035. So how the region meets its energy demand will matter not only for itself, but also for the rest of the world. With that background, I am going to organize my remark around the three main points. The first one is that the climate policy in the region is moving, but they are not moving together. The policy map on your right show how countries in the region are doing in terms of their climate and energy policy. Some countries, Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam have already had their carbon pricing instrument. Some are pushing on renewable energy auctions. Almost all countries have already had their EV incentive. So the progress is greatly uneven. And that reflects the reality of ASEAN. Countries differ greatly in terms of income level, in terms of institution, and in terms of their implementation capacity. So I do not expect them to have one common carbon price soon. The more realistic path is to have coordination without harmonization. Countries cooperating on practical infrastructure, things like clean energy trade, things like measuring and verifying emissions. The second point is that climate policy now is increasingly fiscal policy and energy security. The figure on your right shows exactly why. When there is an energy crisis, when energy price increase, government often respond with subsidies to shield households and business. So what begins as energy shock, it can quickly become a fiscal challenge. And Indonesia highlights this fiscal trade-off very clearly. Its fossil fuel subsidy is responsible for roughly 2% of GDP, and that is roughly the size of their total government healthcare spending. And this is not just some abstract number. The recent market volatility shows exactly how difficult this balancing act can be. So climate policy in this region, it has to be a part of not only clean investment, but also a broader strategy for energy security, for industrial competitiveness, and also for fiscal resilience. The third point is about the climate coalition that Catherine is going to tell you about. Developing countries do not need a one-size-fits-all carbon price. What they need is a framework that recognizes their differences in income level, in institution, and in implementation capacity. What I like about the coalition is that it recognizes the key design principle for climate cooperation: differentiated responsibility, policy flexibility, capacity building, and smart revenue use. That is why I think ASEAN and other developing countries should engage seriously with the coalition, not because all countries are ready today, but because it is one of the few proposals that try to connect carbon pricing with finance, with technology, and with implementation capacity. Thank you.
Wonderful. So seizing on some of the themes that the three panelists have brought up, I wanted to introduce, as Atifat said, the Open Coalition on Compliance Carbon Markets, which was launched just last month in May in Florence. So as a bit of background, Vaibhav and Frank both referred to the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism policy. And what that policy does, for those of you who aren't steeped in climate policy, it basically says if a jurisdiction has a carbon price, then any exports into that jurisdiction have to pay the carbon price. So this was implemented by the EU starting this year, January 1st. Anyone who exports to the EU has to pay the EU carbon price, which is now around 80 euros per ton, unless, and this is a key unless, they've already paid a carbon price domestically. And so this has led, I have some research that shows this has led to a huge increase in interest in carbon pricing. So even a country like China, 95% of their production in the sectors that are first covered by the CBAM are consumed domestically, but still for that 5%, they really did not want to be writing checks to the EU. And so China, in March of last year, expanded their carbon pricing scheme to cover 3 of the 4 CBAM sectors. And so Vaibhav, Atifat, Frank, and I, as I said, are part of this group, and we got together about 15, 16 months ago and started thinking about the CBAM, we think is, well, let me articulate my view and you guys can chime in. The CBAM has been just tremendously successful at driving interest globally in carbon pricing. And I think the CBAM uniquely is kind of addressing what I see as the fundamental challenge with climate policy, which is the lack of a global government, basically. The world is pretty good at addressing environmental problems. Beijing air quality has improved dramatically. The difficulty with climate is the collective action problem, that we don't have a global governance structure to kind of solve the collective action problem. So what the CBAM does is by essentially imposing carbon pricing on countries, even if they themselves don't impose carbon prices, it's getting us closer to this idea, the Nordhaus idea of a climate club. That if you're in the club, you get benefits. If you're in the club with a carbon price, you get benefits. If you're out of the club, you face the carbon price, even when you export to the club. And so we started thinking about, are there ways to preserve the benefits of CBAM but address some of the challenges? Some of the challenges, as Vaibhav described, associated with common but differentiated responsibilities. This idea that the CBAM, the way the EU is implementing it, is imposing the same carbon price no matter the country's level of development. Can we think about maybe a club where you initially differentiate the carbon price required for joining the coalition? And also, can we think about kind of blending together carrots with sticks? Can we think about, if you're a part of the club, maybe, especially if you're a low or low middle income country, part of the club means that you get access to subsidies to decarbonize the sectors. And so we're very fortunate to be able to work closely with the Ministry of Finance in Brazil. Brazil last year hosted the annual Conference of the Parties, the big climate conference, and Brazil liked the idea of this climate coalition. And so at the COP last year, Brazil and 20 countries endorsed the Open Coalition on Compliance Carbon Markets, and then May of this last year formally launched it. And at the launch, the EU and China decided to co-lead with Brazil. So, you know, big support from the world's biggest emitter and from the EU. And so hopefully this will lead to kind of more and more interest in carbon pricing, more and more standardization. I think before we start trading allowances or trading carbon permits across countries, we are at least trading steel, aluminum, very carbon intensive goods, and so we need to think about how to kind of coordinate or at least like recognize carbon prices that have been paid domestically. Okay, so with that introduction to the Open Coalition, I want to turn to the panelists and ask for kind of responses and how you think, you know, Atifat has described a little bit about how ASEAN countries might respond to the Open Coalition. So let me start with Vaibhav, and what's your sense for how the Indian government might think about the Open Coalition?
Sure. So I think the idea of coalition is important to the government. They are thinking about it, but I think it's probably the world we are living in, that the only thing they are thinking about is how to retaliate. It's probably not to how to join this particular coalition. I think they are also exploring right now, can we have a South-South coalition? Because I think this, in the long game, it's not just about the EU at all. I think the way it is perceived, that this is just the beginning. And many in the developed world, many countries are going to start their own border carbon taxes. UK is already discussing, Australia is discussing, US before President Trump also had this discussion, about its own border carbon tax. So sooner than later, all the value chains, and even if you export, let's say if India exports to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh, let's say India exports steel, and Bangladesh creates a product and exports, even that is going to be taxed. So the ultimate idea is all value chains, doesn't matter whether you directly export to EU, wherever you are exporting, it is taxed. And that's what EU's motivation was also, like you kind of price carbon on all kinds of things, across, beyond your own jurisdiction. So I think in the long game, they are not thinking about just the EU. The question is, when that happens, how are you better prepared? And it's always better to be prepared through in a coalition kind of architecture. The question is, who is in that coalition? Who do you want to kind of shake your hands with? And that's why I think the first steps are that they're trying to shake hands with some others in the developing world, and in a very retaliatory kind of mindset. How do we retaliate against it so that it doesn't expand? What do we do about it? So that's how I think they're taking the steps. And the retaliation might not be a price retaliation, because we don't import a lot. So if you don't import a lot, how do you do, your own tax is not going to be effective. So a very interesting example I heard in one of the panel discussions at COP, and this was an African expert. So he said that, well, we don't import a lot, but what we have done now after CBAM, the critical mineral mines that we were discussing with EU, now we have decided that we'll go with China. And that is a very interesting form of retaliation. So it's not a price retaliation, but countries are responding to this CBAM and the idea of coalition. The interesting part is now, because China and Brazil are part of this coalition, they're also from the developing world, right? So that's a motivation for India to be at least in the room. So we are having those discussions. But yes, retaliation is what people are exploring. That's also I should put it.
So geoeconomic warfare, yeah.
Yes.
Frank, how about Australia?
Yeah, well, in Australia, for sure, there's a predilection towards sensible economic policy instruments, right? And so carbon pricing is very much at the top of that. But there's a difficult policy history to that, right? I mean, Australia is the only major country where an encompassing, broad-based, well-designed carbon pricing scheme was implemented and then rescinded again, right? It was in operation for 2 years, and then there was a change in government, and the thing was abolished again. So there's a difficult history there. As an open trading, open investment regime country, Australia for sure has an intrinsic interest in economically sound global policy settings, right? An interest inherently in open and level playing field trade, for example, right? And so all of these things I would surmise will kind of favor an Australian perspective that supports these kinds of things, right? Without speculating on the particular position that any particular government might take at any one point in time.
Yeah. Something that we've heard from other governments is the fact that kind of global momentum gives them domestic political cover. That maybe it will be harder for Australia to get rid of the carbon tax because if there is global momentum, it's perceived as, we're not pushing this, but it's the rest of the world that's kind of dragging us along.
And certainly that's the case with regard to the border carbon adjustment, right? And look, it's kind of a really nerdy kind of thing that environmental economists have gotten excited about, or a subset of the environmental economics community has gotten excited about for the last 30 years, right?
Yeah.
Really nerdy little thing, right? That is now center stage in international economic policy, right? And it's not even that large in terms of the revenue that will be created or the economic effects that it'll have. It'll be tightly constrained to a few industries: cement, steel, aluminium, and downstream industries. That's it, right? But of course, right, Viper, as you pointed out, right, this opens the door, really, right, to climate change policy instruments being applied to trade, right? And thereby it mixes in sometimes uncomfortable way with the sort of partial collapse of the free and open and rules-based trading system that we see unfold really more or less, right? And it of course interacts in complicated ways with national green industry and climate policy as well, right? And so it's kind of really center stage. And I would just say, you know, like we're here at the World Economic of the World Congress of the International Economic Association, right? It's just really an encouragement when you have the opportunity to speak with your own policymakers, right? There is a need in many, many jurisdictions to help create basic understandings of the mechanisms and the connections between different policy instruments.
Yeah, so Atifat, you brought up the idea of the revenues, the fiscal revenues that carbon pricing brings in. So how do you see carbon pricing interacting with other climate policies? Can the revenue from carbon pricing be used to fund subsidies, or what are some of the linkages between carbon pricing and some of the other policies?
Yeah, I think that is an important point, because when we talk about climate policy, it is difficult to separate that from development policy, from things like energy security and, of course, fiscal resilience. And as I mentioned, when you look at Indonesia, the cost of fossil fuel subsidy is 2% of GDP. And they are struggling with the market right now.
And that was 2024, before
and with the recent Middle East tension, that is going to be even more pressure. So countries in the region are trying to balance that with fiscal policy, and they are looking at carbon tax. And as you mentioned, there is a good cover now because we are looking at CBAM, right? And it is unavoidable that we should have a carbon pricing. And I guess the more realistic path is to have an industrial carbon pricing, and it will be more selective on only trade export sectors. And of course, the revenue has to be shared in a way that balance between sectors that are affected and the competitiveness objective.
Yeah, so one of the things that the report that our group wrote, one of the things that we focused on is the heavy industries, as both Frank and Atifat have suggested. And, you know, we don't think about those much from an economic perspective. Aluminum, cement, steel, fertilizer, they're maybe 4% of global GDP, but from an emissions perspective, they're 20%. They're just like hugely important. I did a calculation recently. So projections for 2030 suggest that, you know, electricity use from AI is just taking off, but still at the high end of the estimates in 2030, it's going to be like 10% of the energy consumption of the steel industry, and probably even a smaller share of emissions, because electricity is clean for the most part, and steel is continuing to be made in a lot of parts of the world with coal. So from a climate perspective, we can talk about AI, but we should really, really be talking about these heavy industries. Okay, so Vaibhav, the Open Coalition was announced at COP by Brazil, but it was not part of the formal COP process. So the formal COP process is the UN-driven, you know, let's get 195 countries around the table and come up with some kind of consensus. How do you see the kind of tension between these, like, subset of country coalition type approaches and the COP process? How do you see those evolving over the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think the COP process is getting interesting. What the Brazilians did was very interesting. So at COPs, every like the first 2 days is always this what we call the agenda fight. What gets to be on the agenda of COP. And that's where the developing world has always said that this unilateral trade measures and this climate trade discussion should be on the main agenda. The developed world never agreed to it, you know, so there was a big fight always in the Bonn sessions as well as COPs. The Brazilians did something very interesting. They said, well, why do you need to, for a conversation, why do you need to put this on the agenda? We'll still create a space for the conversation, but it is still off the agenda, right? So that's why at the last COP, the most contentious issues, including the trade measure, was discussed heavily, but this was like off the agenda. It was a very interesting institutional, you could say, innovation that the Brazilians did, but that is now, and the same with the fossil fuel roadmap. That was also off the agenda. These have become the biggest debates at the COP level. So the way it appears to be now, that there will be a formal COP agenda, which is about the Paris Agreement, the goals of the Paris Agreement, that will continue to evolve the way it has been evolving, which is kind of less controversial. It is a lot more operational in nature. So that will continue to evolve. But all the contentious issues are going to be like on these other tracks, which are like off the agenda. But that's where most of the public attention, most of the real tensions are happening on those other side rooms. And that's where I think to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, right? The Paris Agreement was supposed to create a lot like architecture and instruments to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement. Now, the goal is ambiguous, because it says well below 2 degrees up to 1.5 degrees, because the world didn't agree to a clear goal, so to speak. So the goal is ambiguous. The goal setting process was extremely important, but because there was so much tussle, the goal was never agreed. So what it did, it gave a bit of ambiguity. So ambiguity, which makes everybody comfortable. So all countries are comfortable. Mm-hmm. They can draw whatever they want from that high-level goal, and everybody is saying, I'm aligned with the Paris Agreement. But all the UN reports show that when you add up their own individual pledges and actions, you never add up to the Paris Agreement goal, right? So, and that I think will continue to happen just because of that ambiguity at the highest level. That is why the role of these non-Paris kind of things, which is the coalition, which are like, you could say, you have to support these through these outside measures to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, because the instruments that were envisaged to be a part of the agreement are not able to deliver on it. Mm-hmm. So you have to do these outside things, and that is where I think that is the future of coalition. It will never probably get into the formal thing, but it will be a very important instrument to still achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Frank, do you want to come in on this? You've had a lot of experience with the UNFCCC process. How do you see the tension between the 195 countries versus the subset coalition approach? How do you see that developing?
Yeah, Paris Agreement 2015 was really a triumph of global cooperation, right? But it could only be achieved with that ambiguity, right? That you mentioned. Now it gets to the real issues, right? It gets to climate finance in terms of money that needs to flow from rich countries to poor countries to deal with climate change. And that's deadlocked, right? And then it goes to, okay, so how do we achieve staying below 2 degrees or not rising too much above 2 degrees? And that means, right, curtailing the production use of fossil fuels, right? And that's something that cannot be effectively debated in the UN forum, because you need consensus. You will not get to an agreement. There's too many nations in there that see fossil fuel production and exports as a core economic interest, and that effectively see their optimal strategy in delaying the process of that, right? And so out of that, you've now got a sort of another coalition of the willing, right? Yeah. The transitioning away from fossil fuels process. At its first conference in Colombia earlier this year at Santa Marta, about 60 countries participated, invitation only, including fossil fuel producers, but not the major spoilers, basically. So the United States were not at the table, Saudi Arabia, Russia, a few others were not at the table, right, quite notably. And that allowed for a really inclusive, open process where governments could actually discuss the issues that are on their minds, right, including ways to gradually transition these industries down, right? A big topic was what is everyone doing to help with the regional economic adjustment and social and worker adjustment in coal-fired power stations, in coal mines, et cetera, right? Practical discussions around policy that can ease adjustment, basically, right? And so it's clearly seen as a prospective way forward, and a notable aspect of this process, which will be continued under the presidency of Tuvalu and Ireland next year, and then probably some other set of countries the year after, is that there is a really active civil society inclusion element, right, including for the academic and research community, and there we're involved with trying to shepherd that process a little, and I could only wish for greater involvement of economists in that process, right? Because, the kind of advice that comes out in some part grates a little bit, perhaps, with what most of us in this room would consider the correct advice for long-term efficiency, Okay, and so there's an opportunity, I think, that's opening up to provide solid economically based analysis into a government process that might actually be consequential to some extent.
How do we get more economists involved? I mean, one thing I really liked about the Open Coalition is it was led by Brazil's Ministry of Finance. And I think ministries of finance tend to be staffed by economists, tend to, think about economic implications of things. So, yeah, what are some other ways to get more economists involved in these decisions?
Yeah, good point, right? I mean, it's been like this for a long time. When you see the environment ministers involved, you think, okay, that's nice. When you see the finance ministers or treasurers involved, you think, yep, okay, it's getting serious now.
Yeah.
The Santa Marta process, which will unfold next year and thereafter as well, actually has a relatively open structure for engagement of the research sector. And so this year it was kind of a really chaotic process at short notice that essentially consisted of self-nomination of interested organizations, right? And so it's unclear to what extent that will be retained, but I think there will be pathways and channels for interested organizations to essentially self-nominate to provide input into that process, my expectation.
And Atif, in my mind, so the Open Coalition is an example of kind of coordination on a specific policy, but another approach to coalition or coordination would be more regionally focused. So what are the prospects for like an ASEAN-based coordination on a bunch of clean energy topics?
Yeah, so building on my earlier point, I do not expect the region like ASEAN to have one common carbon price soon. I think the more realistic path is to cooperate on areas where there are clear regional gains. And there are at least two areas. The first one is clean energy trade. The region is going to see a lot of a high increase in energy demand from manufacturing electric vehicle to EV centers, right? The risk is that this is going to be met mostly by coal and natural gas, but the opportunity is that there are complementary resources. Countries in the Indo-China region, they have hydropower, they have wind, they have solar. The challenge is how to build infrastructure and rules to make this clean energy trade work. The second area is about carbon reporting and standards. Business in the region, they are worried not only about paying the carbon price, but also about how to make sure that the carbon content, how they measure, how they verify emissions are credible to the people who buy the products, right? And I guess that may be less ambitious than a common carbon price, but it is an area where we can see a clear gains, a clear advantage in the near and medium term.
Yeah, no, I think those issues of measurement come up with carbon pricing too. We had a roundtable at London Climate Week that involved industry representatives, and we heard that very loud and clear, that they were worried about the proliferation of a bunch of different measurement and reporting standards. Like if Australia has a CBAM and the EU has a CBAM, the UK has a CBAM, and they all have different ways of collecting data, and if one of them treats pulp and paper manufacturers that reforest differently than pulp and paper manufacturers that don't. They're just like all these kind of technical details that become a nuisance for companies. And so I think some standardization around that. I think it helps us think about carbon pricing implementation as well as the measurement topic just itself. Okay, so Vaibhav, how about in India? What are some kind of non-carbon pricing policies that you see developing? I know, Modi has made some really strong commitments to solar, for instance, right?
Yes. So there are always going to be a bunch of complementary policies which are there. But I want to touch back on another point that you are just talking about. This EU is using a very interesting term. They're calling it effective carbon price. Right? And that's extremely interesting. So which basically means that, let's say, if out of India's total steel production, 10% is being exported, So they're not really bothered about if that 10% pays a carbon price. They're saying, well, all of your steel production should be paying a carbon price. And that is what is the most bizarre thing. And that is what the fear is about. So it is not just your exports. This whole notion of what is an effective carbon price is like it's effective only when everybody is paying that same carbon price, even if you're not exporting, even if it is for domestic consumption. So, and that is why this big tussle, that this is kind of tricky because you're now getting into a sovereign territory, right? So you're not, exports is fine at some level still, but you are making it a lot more than the exports. So which is why a lot of this kind of challenge is emerging. And yes, I mean, in terms of the domestic climate policies, carbon pricing is one of the instruments. It's very important, it's gaining importance, but I always say we should, I mean, it is never given. You're given in the sense there are many people who are still critics of carbon price. So there is an economics behind carbon price which is very strong, but there is also a political economy. And the political economy emerges when, when we start seeing the negative impacts of, let's say, a higher carbon price. And the thing with carbon price is it's very easy to make it a villain. So it's interesting because in India's renewable sector, for example, there is a very stringent renewables policy, but it is driven by subsidies. It's a very nice framing, So you're subsidizing the sector, you're bringing jobs, you're creating manufacturing. Everything is very nice about that framing. The carbon price is a lot less, is stringency. But it's very easy to make carbon price a villain because the moment it becomes higher, you will say, well, this leads to loss of competitiveness, job losses, and those kinds of things. So, and the question which we are trying to tell everybody, that the instrument is always secondary, it's the stringency of climate policy. And whichever instrument you choose to achieve a particular level of stringency, it will show up somewhere. In your economy, it will show up somewhere. The carbon pricing is the easiest, to understand in that sense. And that's why it is getting some. So the only point I'm making, let's wait to see how things evolve, because I'm expecting a backlash to also happen when the prices increase, and that's where the role of these alternative or complementary instruments, which have a nicer framing around them, will probably become a lot more important. And the efficiency gains, whatever economists, as we keep talking about, they're probably going to be lost in that political economy kind of setup,
Yeah, but I also think that we as a profession do a disservice to carbon pricing by insisting on it as the only policy.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes,
you can
yes.
have lots of policies, right?
Yes.
You can have carbon pricing paying for subsidies because, as you say, the industry loves subsidies, but you got to pay for them somehow.
Yes.
All right, so let me ask one more question of the panel, and then happy to throw it out to the audience for any questions that come up here. So is there one topic that we haven't touched on that you think is important for a group or a room full of economists to hear about to appreciate the future prospects of climate change? Frank?
Yes, and I think that question goes to you, Catherine. How will the United States act in this space in the future? I think this is the topic we should be talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you for giving me that entree. That's the huge question. I guess I think from a non-economics perspective, I served in the Biden administration and was involved in sanctions policy globally. And I think the U.S., and I don't think this is well enough appreciated by U.S. climate policy makers. The U.S. has like soft power. I just think that the world, for better, and now for worse, I think, just looks to the U.S. or is used to having the U.S. serve this leadership position. So I think that's the additional cost of not having the U.S. at the table. I don't know. I think that the CBAM, if Canada and Mexico put on border carbon adjustments and U.S. industry comes to, a Vance administration, an AOC administration, those are both administrations not naturally inclined to do carbon pricing. But I think if it just becomes clear that we're writing checks to the rest of the world that we could keep domestically if we put on a carbon price, I think maybe the fiscal pressures that the U.S. is likely to experience going forward, very likely to experience. The Social Security Trust Fund is nearing bankruptcy. There are lots and lots of fiscal pressures. Yeah, I learned when I was in D.C. the term hope casting rather than forecasting. I know climate policy, carbon pricing in particular, has been particularly fraught in the US, but yeah, I hope, Cass, that the right set of pressures will come to bear on the US, whatever the political situation is.
Great, sure, thank
Bye,
you.
Bob. Another topic that we haven't talked about.
Sure, yeah. So climate policy has to be based on the best available science, right? So the question is, what is the best available science telling us? And now the new conversation that is emerging is very interesting. So there's a new word I'm just throwing out to all the colleagues here. It's called overshoot. Mm-hmm. So that's a new term. It's extremely important. So I think the conversation from like 4 years from now are going to be all about overshoot. So what is this overshoot? Well, as a world, now it is by and large expected we'll cross this 1.5 degree C threshold sooner than later. We are on that track, right? So the policy context is now, everybody till now was talking mostly about how do we limit temperature to 1.5 degrees C. Now the conversation has already started emerging that because we are going to cross it, how do we minimize the peak warming level and come back to 1.5? Because one could argue some countries who are not opposed to this are saying, well, we have breached 1.5, let's not worry about it, let's go to 2. Let's adopt 2 degrees as the next target, right? But many of us are saying, well, maybe not, that's not the smartest thing to do. So now the question is, how do we limit the peak warming level? Yeah. Whatever it is, 1.7, 1.8, whatever it is, the lesser the better. And then how do we get back to 1.5? So now in terms of the policy, there are 2 phases. One is a phase, you could say, which is before the peak warming level. And the phase after the peak warming level, when you get back to 1.5 and below. And the kinds of things we need to do in terms of transition and in terms of the instrument needed for that transition are going to be like, you could say, framed differently, and they're going to be different. And that's where, for example, the whole conversation on CDR, which is carbon dioxide removal. It's extremely important, but especially the post-peak warming level. That's where it comes in an extremely big way. And all these industries like steel and cement, they are extremely important, especially in this pre-peak warming level, just to minimize the level of peak, do it as early as possible. So I think that is a new conversation, and I think 4 or 5 years from now, overshoot will probably be the biggest debate happening in climate policy. Thank you.
Atifat, any missing topics from your perspective?
Yeah, I think one area that many economists should pay more attention to is implementation capacity. We often debate about the right tool, carbon pricing, ETS, or some subsidy, right? But the real challenge in many developing countries, as Vaibhav mentioned, is that how do we implement this policy credibly and sustain it politically? How do we make sure that we can measure emissions in a way that is credible? How can the policy survive the next energy shock or even the next election cycle, right? And this is an area where I think when you look at the climate policy, we have to combine that with institution, with MRV, and with implementation capacity to make it really work.
Yeah, the state capacity issues. I'm relatively optimistic about the MRV because I think, like satellite technology, I think there's all this development on the technological side. All right, we probably have time for one question from the audience. If not, good. There's a microphone.
Sorry. Too relevant a topic to be left without a question. So I'm Alexandra, I live in Serbia, and I spoke with our colleague about climate change and assessments and those things. If you were to point to one of the past models or role model for including climate screening in decision-making processes for investments and asset management, and in particular in public administration as such, so mainstreaming it as an approach, where you would point to? Which country is, according to you, having the most successful, let's say, implementation of the climate screening and the usage of data?
Most successful country.
What are your favorite models, or which one would you recommend?
All of us are totally speechless on this one. Yeah, because I mean, it's kind of
I
very
have an
challenging.
idea in my head, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, please go ahead. I think you should have a better answer than
Frank?
me.
I think New Zealand's doing pretty well. I mean, New Zealand has brought the forestry sector into a cap and trade market in a really interesting way. I think normally forestry is treated with like offset credits, which are very difficult and problematic because getting paid not to deforest brings up these important additionality or baseline questions. But New Zealand has just said, like, the whole forest is part of the cap and trade market. Anyone who deforests has to pay a carbon price. Anyone who brings forest back, restores forest, gets a credit. I don't know.
I'd point to the rules for financial disclosure, really, right, in private investment, which are being adopted actually gradually in many countries, as something that has real promise for, I think, in particular for investment, as your question was about, in terms of disclosure of investment options and investment portfolios of transition risk. So is it high carbon and thereby under risk for current business models, or is it already low carbon? And also climate impact risks, right? Is it vulnerable to future climate change or not? There's an increasing, regulatory requirement to disclose that information, and that should actually, that additional information should lead to investment responses in the correct direction, right?
Yeah, and just to add on to that, many central banks are now getting very active in this space, including the Reserve Bank of India, just to better understand how a carbon price or a transition risk could impact the financial sector stability. So the debate has reached at that level, because there could be potential negative impacts on the stability level, the financial and macro stability level. So I think those things have started happening, and structures are being put in place across countries to better understand that aspect.
Okay, I'm glad that we're ending with that, because I would say that that's an example of something that came up through like a coalition process,
Yes,
right? The
yes.
Network for Greening the Financial System,
Yes.
Mark Carney's, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, but not through COP. So
Yes,
maybe that's
yes.
a lesson that, yeah,
Exactly.
those types of processes lead to success.
Yes.
All right. So please join me in thanking the panel for this great discussion.